This is Chapter 51 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 51, The Failure of Webster and Company, Around the World, Sorrow. In a room at the Players Club, a cheap room, he wrote home, at $1.50 per day, Mark Twain spent the winter, hoping against hope to weather the financial storm. His fortunes were at a lower ebb than ever before, lower even than during those bleak mining days among the Esmeralda hills. Then there had been no one but himself, and he was young. Now, at 58, he had precious lives dependent upon him, and he was weighed down by debt. The liabilities of his firm were fully $200,000, $60,000 of which were owing to Mrs. Clemens for money advanced, but the large remaining sum was due to banks, printers, binders, and the manufacturers of paper. A panic was on the land, and there was no business. What he was to do Clemens did not know. He spent most of his days in his room, trying to write, and succeeded in finishing several magazine articles. Outwardly cheerful, he hid the bitterness of his situation. A few, however, knew the true state of his affairs. One of these one night introduced him to Henry H. Rogers, the Standard Oil millionaire. "Mr. Clemens," said Mr. Rogers, "I was one of your early admirers. I heard your lecture a long time ago on the Sandwich Islands." They sat down at a table, and Mark Twain told amusing stories. Rogers was in a perpetual gale of laughter. They became friends from that evening, and in due time the author had confessed to the financier all his business worries. "You had better let me look into things a little," Rogers said, and he advised Clemens to stop walking the floor. It was characteristic of Mark Twain to be willing to unload his affairs upon anyone that he thought able to bear the burden. He became a new man overnight. With Henry Rogers in charge, life was once more worth while. He accepted invitations from the Rogers family and from many others, and was presently so gay, so widely sought, and seen in so many places that one of his acquaintances, Jamie Dodge, dubbed him the Belle of New York. Henry Rogers, meanwhile, was looking into things. He had reasonable faith in the type machine, and advanced a large sum on the chance of its proving a success. This, of course, lifted Mark Twain quite into the clouds. Daily he wrote and cabled all sorts of glowing hopes to his family, then in Paris. Once he wrote, "The ship is in sight now. When the anchor is down, then I shall say, farewell, a long farewell, to business. I will never touch it again. I will live in literature. I will wallow in it, revel in it. I will swim in ink." Once he cabled, "Expect good news in 10 days," and a little later, "Look out for good news," and in a few days, "Nearing success." Those cellar-like messages could not but appeal to Mrs. Clemens' sense of humor, even in those dark days. To her sister she wrote, "They make me laugh, for they are so like my beloved Colonel." The affairs of Webster and Company Mr. Rogers found a bad way. When at last in April 1894 the crisis came, a demand by the chief creditors for payment, he advised immediate assignment as the only course. So the firm of Webster and Company closed its doors. The business which less than 10 years before had begun so prosperously had ended in failure. Mark Twain, nearing 59, was bankrupt. When all the firm's effects had been sold and applied on the counts, he was still more than $70,000 in debt. Friends stepped in and offered to lend him money, but he declined these offers. Through Mr. Rogers a basis of settlement at 50 cents on the dollar was arranged, and Mark Twain said, "Give me time, and I will pay the other 50." No one but his wife and Mr. Rogers, however, believed that at his age he would be able to make good the promise. Many advised him not to attempt it, but to settle once and for all on the legal basis as arranged. Sometimes, in moments of despondency, he almost surrendered. Once he said, I need not dream of paying it. I never could manage it." But these were only the hard moments. For the most part he kept up good heart and confidence. It is true that he now believed again in the future of the typesetter, and that returns from it would pay him out of bankruptcy. But later in the year this final hope was taken away. Mr. Rogers wrote to him that in the final test the machine had failed to prove itself practical, and that the whole project had been finally and permanently abandoned. The shock of disappointment was heavy for the moment, but then it was over, completely over, for that old mechanical demon, that vampire of invention that had sapped his fortune so long, was laid at last. The worst had happened. There was nothing more to dread. Within a week Mark Twain (he was now back in Paris with the family) had settled down to work once more on the Recollections of Joan, and all mention and memory of the typesetter was forever put away. The machine stands today in the Sibley College of Engineering, where it is exhibited as the costliest piece of mechanism for its size ever constructed. Mark Twain once received a letter from an author who had written a book to assist inventors and patentees, asking for his endorsement. He replied, "Dear Sir, I have, as you say, been interested in patents and patentees. If your book tells how to exterminate inventors, send me 9 editions. Send them by express. Very truly yours, S. L. Clemens." Those were economical days. There was no income except from the old books, and at the time this was not large. The Clemens family, however, was cheerful, and Mark Twain was once more in splendid working form. The story of Joan hurried to its tragic conclusion. Each night he read to the family what he had written that day, and Susy, who was easily moved, would say, "Wait, wait till I get my handkerchief." And one night, when the last pages had been written and read, and the fearful scene at Rouen had been depicted, Susy wrote in her diary, "Tonight Joan of Arc was burned at the stake," meaning that the book was finished. Susy herself had fine literary taste, and might have written had not her greater purpose been to sing. There are fragments of her writing that show the true literary touch. Both Susy and her father cared more for Joan than for any of the former books. To Mr. Rogers, Clemens wrote, "Possibly the book may not sell, but that is nothing. It was written for love." It was placed serially with Harper's Magazine and appeared anonymously, but the public soon identified the inimitable touch of Mark Twain. It was now the spring of 1895, and Mark Twain had decided upon a new plan to restore his fortunes. Platform work had always paid him well, and though he disliked it now more than ever, he had resolved upon something unheard of in that time, nothing less, in fact, than a platform tour around the world. In May, with the family, he sailed for America, and after a month or two of rest at Quarry Farm he set out with Mrs. Clemens and Clara, and with his American agent, J. B. Pond, for the Pacific coast. Susy and Jean remained behind with their aunt at the farm. The travelers left Elmira at night, and they always remembered the picture of Susy standing under the electric light of the railway platform, waving them good-bye. Mark Twain's tour of the world was a success from the beginning. Everywhere he was received with splendid honors, in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in India, in Ceylon, in South Africa. Wherever he went his welcome was a grand ovation. His theaters and halls were never large enough to hold his audiences. With the possible exception of General Grant's long tour in 1878-79, there had hardly been a more gorgeous progress than Mark Twain's trip around the world. Everywhere they were overwhelmed with attention and gifts. We cannot begin to tell the story of that journey here. In Following the Equator, the author himself tells it in his own delightful fashion. From time to time along the way Mark Twain forwarded his accumulated profits to Mr. Rogers to apply against his debts, and by the time they sailed from South Africa the sum was large enough to encourage him to believe that, with the royalties to be derived from the book he would write of his travels, he might be able to pay in full and so face the world once more a free man. Their long trip, it had lasted a full year, was nearing its end. They would spend the winter in London. Susy and Jean were notified to join them there. They would all be reunited again. The outlook seemed bright once more. They reached England the last of July. Susy and Jean, with Katie Leary, were to arrive on the 12th of August. But the 12th did not bring them. It brought, instead, a letter. Susy was not well, the letter said. The sailing had been postponed. The letter added that it was nothing serious, but her parents cabled at once for later news. Receiving no satisfactory answer, Mrs. Clemens, full of forebodings, prepared to sail with Clara for America. Clemens would remain in London to arrange for the winter residence. A cable came, saying Susy's recovery would be slow but certain. Mrs. Clemens and Clara sailed immediately. In some notes he once dictated, Mark Twain said, "That was the 15th of August, 1896. 3 days later, when my wife and Clara were about half-way across the ocean, I was standing in our dining-room, thinking of nothing in particular, when a cablegram was put into my hand. It said, 'Susy was peacefully released today.'" Mark Twain's life had contained other tragedies, but no other that equaled this one. The dead girl had been his heart's pride. It was a year since they parted, and now he knew he would never see her again. The blow had found him alone and among strangers. In that day he could not even reach out to those upon the ocean, drawing daily nearer to the heartbreak. Susy Clemens had died in the old Hartford home. She had been well for a time at the farm, but then her health had declined. She worked continuously at her singing lessons and overtried her strength. Then she went on a visit to Mrs. Charles Dudley Warner in Hartford, but she did not rest, working harder than ever at her singing. Finally she was told that she must consult a physician. The doctor came and prescribed soothing remedies, and advised that she have the rest and quiet of her own home. Mrs. Crane came from Elmira, also her uncle Charles Langdon, but Susy became worse, and a few days later her malady was pronounced meningitis. This was the 15th of August, the day that her mother and Clara sailed from England. She was delirious and burning with fever, but at last sank into unconsciousness. She died 3 days later, and on the night that Mrs. Clemens and Clara arrived was taken to Elmira for burial. They laid her beside the little brother that had died so long before, and ordered a headstone with some lines which they had found in Australia, written by Robert Richardson. "Warm summer sun, shine kindly here. Warm southern wind, blow softly here. Green sod above, lie light, lie light. Good night, dear heart. Good night, good night." End of chapter 51. This is chapter 52 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 52. European Economies. With Clara and Jean, Mrs. Clemens returned to England, and in a modest house on Tedworth Square, a secluded corner of London, the stricken family hid themselves away for the winter. Few, even of their closest friends, knew of their whereabouts. In time the report was circulated that Mark Twain, old, sick, and deserted by his family, was living in poverty, toiling to pay his debts. Through the London publishers, a distant cousin, Dr. James Clemens, of St. Louis, located the house on Tedworth Square, and wrote offering assistance. He was invited to call, and found a quiet place, the life there simple, but not poverty. By and by there was another report, this time that Mark Twain was dead. A reporter found his way to Tedworth Square, and, being received by Mark Twain himself, asked what he should say. Clemens regarded him gravely, then, in his slow, nasal drawl, "Say that the report of my death has been grossly exaggerated," a remark that a day later was amusing both hemispheres. He could not help his humor. It was his natural form of utterance, the medium for conveying fact, fiction, satire, philosophy. Whatever his depth of despair, the quaint surprise of speech would come, and it would be so until his last day. By November he was at work on his book of travel, which he first thought of calling Around the World. He went out not at all that winter, and the work progressed steadily, and was complete by the following May, 1897. Meantime, during his trip around the world, Mark Twain's publishers had issued 2 volumes of his work, the Joan of Arc book and another Tom Sawyer book, the latter volume combining 2 rather short stories, Tom Sawyer Abroad, published serially in St. Nicholas, and Tom Sawyer, Detective. The Joan of Arc book, the tenderest and most exquisite of all Mark Twain's work, a tale told with the deepest sympathy and the rarest delicacy, was dedicated by the author to his wife, as being the only piece of his writing which he considered worthy of this honor. He regarded it as his best book, and this was an opinion that did not change. 12 years later, it was on his 73rd birthday, he wrote as his final verdict, November 30th, 1908, "I like the Joan of Arc best of all my books, and it is the best. I know it perfectly well, and besides, it furnished me 7 times the pleasure afforded me by any of the others. 12 years of preparation and 2 years of writing. The others needed no preparation and got none." Mark Twain. The public at first did not agree with the author's estimate, and the demand for the book was not large. But the public amended its opinion. The demand for Joan increased with each year until its sales ranked with the most popular of Mark Twain's books. The new stories of Tom and Huck have never been as popular as the earlier adventures of this pair of heroes. The shorter stories are less important and perhaps less alive, but they are certainly very readable tales, and nobody but Mark Twain could have written them. Clemens began some new stories when his travel book was out of the way, but presently, with the family, was on the way to Switzerland for the summer. They lived at Weggis, on Lake Lucerne, in the Villa Buleg, a very modest 5-franc-a-day pension, for they were economizing and putting away money for the debts. Mark Twain was not in a mood for work, and besides, proofs of the new book, Following the Equator, as it is now called, were coming steadily. But on the anniversary of Susy's death, August 18th, he wrote a poem, In Memoriam, in which he touched a literary height never before attained. It was published in Harper's Magazine, and now appears in his collected works. Across from Villa Buleg, on the lake front, there was a small shaded enclosure where he loved to sit and look out on the blue water and lofty mountains, one of which, Rigi, he and Twichell had climbed 19 years before. The little retreat is still there, and today one of the trees bears a tablet, in German, Mark Twain's Rest. Autumn found the family in Vienna, located for the winter at the Hotel Metropole. Mrs. Clemens realized that her daughters must no longer be deprived of social and artistic advantages. For herself, she longed only for retirement. Vienna is always a gay city, a center of art and culture and splendid social functions. From the moment of his arrival, Mark Twain and his family were in the midst of affairs. Their room at the Metropole became an assembling place for distinguished members of the several circles that go to make up the dazzling Viennese life. Mrs. Clemens, to her sister in America, once wrote, "Such funny combinations are here sometimes. 1 duke, several counts, several writers, several barons, 2 princes, newspaper women, etc." Mark Twain found himself the literary lion of the Austrian capital. Every club entertained him and roared with delight at his German speeches. Wherever he appeared on the streets he was recognized. "Let him pass! Don't you see it is Herr Mark Twain?" commanded an officer to a guard who, in the midst of a great assemblage, had presumed to bar the way. End of Chapter 52. This is Chapter 53 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 53, Mark Twain Pays His Debts. Mark Twain wrote much and well during this period, in spite of his social life. His article "Concerning the Jews" was written that first winter in Vienna, a fine piece of special pleading. Also, the greatest of his short stories, one of the greatest of all short stories, "The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg." But there were good reasons why he should write better now. His mind was free of a mighty load. He had paid his debts. Soon after his arrival in Vienna he had written to Mr. Rogers, "Let us begin on those debts. I cannot bear the weight any longer. It totally unfits me for work." He had accumulated a large sum for the purpose, and the royalties from the new book were beginning to roll in. Payment of the debts was begun. At the end of December he wrote again, "Land, we are glad to see those debts diminishing. For the first time in my life I am getting more pleasure from paying money out than from pulling it in." A few days later he wrote to Howells that he had turned the corner, and again, "We've lived close to the bone and saved every cent we could, and there's no undisputed claim now that we can't cash. I hope you will never get the like of the load saddled on to you that was saddled on to me 3 years ago, and yet there is such a solid pleasure in paying the things that I reckon it is worth while to get into that kind of a hobble after all. Mrs. Clemens gets millions of delight out of it, and the children have never uttered one complaint about the scrimping from the beginning." By the end of January, 1898, Clemens had accumulated enough money to make the final payments to his creditors. At the time of his failure he had given himself 5 years to achieve this result, but he had needed less than 4. A report from Mr. Rogers showed that a balance of $13,000 would remain to his credit after the last accounts were wiped away. Clemens had tried to keep his money affairs out of the newspapers, but the payment of the final claims could not be concealed, and the press made the most of it. Headlines shouted it. Editorials heralded Mark Twain as a second Walter Scott, because Scott, too, had labored to lift a great burden of debt. Never had Mark Twain been so beloved by his fellow men. One might suppose now that he had had enough of invention and commercial enterprises of every sort. That is, one who did not know Mark Twain might suppose this, but it would not be true. Within a month after his debts were paid, he was negotiating with the Austrian inventor Szczepanik for the American rights in a wonderful carpet-pattern machine, and, Sellers-like, was planning to organize a company with a capital of $1,500 million to control the carpet-weaving industries of the world. He wrote to Mr. Rogers about the great scheme, inviting the Standard Oil to come in, but the plan failed to bear the test of Mr. Rogers' investigation and was heard of no more. Samuel Clemens' obligation to Henry Rogers was very great, but it was not quite the obligation that many supposed it to be. It was often asserted that the financier lent, even gave the humorist large sums, and pointed out opportunities for speculation. No part of this statement is true. Mr. Rogers neither lent nor gave Mark Twain money, and never allowed him to speculate when he could prevent it. He sometimes invested Mark Twain's own funds for him, but he never bought for him a share of stock without money in hand to pay for it in full, money belonging to and earned by Clemens himself. What Henry Rogers did give to Mark Twain was his priceless counsel and time, gifts more precious than any mere sum of money, favors that Mark Twain could accept without humiliation. He did accept them, and never ceased to be grateful. He rarely wrote without expressing his gratitude, and we get the size of Mark Twain's obligation when in one letter we read, "I have abundant peace of mind again, no sense of burden. Work is become a pleasure. It is not labor any longer." He wrote much and well, mainly magazine articles, including some of those chapters later gathered in his book on Christian Science. He reveled like a boy in his new freedom and fortunes, in the lavish honors paid him, in the rich circumstance of Viennese life. But always, just beneath the surface, were unforgettable sorrows. His face in repose was always sad. Once, after writing to Howells of his successes, he added, All those things might move and interest one, but how desperately more I have been moved, to-night, by the thought of a little old copy in the nursery of "At the Back of the North Wind." Oh, what happy days they were when that book was read, and how Susy loved it! Chapter 53. This is Chapter 54 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 54, Return After Exile. News came to Vienna of the death of Orion Clemens at the age of 72. Orion had died as he had lived, a gentle dreamer, always with a new plan. He had not been sick at all. One morning early he had seated himself at a table with pencil and paper, and was putting down the details of his latest project, when death came, kindly, in the moment of new hope. He was a generous, upright man, beloved by all who understood him. The Clemenses remained 2 winters in Vienna, spending the second at the Hotel Krantz, where their rooms were larger and finer than at the Metropole, and even more crowded with notabilities. Their salon acquired the name of the Second Embassy, and Mark Twain was, in fact, the most representative American in the Austrian capital. It became the fashion to consult him on every question of public interest, his comments, whether serious or otherwise, being always worth printing. When European disarmament was proposed, editor William T. Stead, of the Review of Reviews, wrote for his opinion. He replied, "Dear Mr. Stead, the Czar is ready to disarm. I am ready to disarm. Collect the others. It should not be much of a task now. Mark Twain." He refused offers of many sorts. He declined $10,000 for a tobacco endorsement, though he liked the tobacco well enough. He declined $10,000 a year for 5 years to lend his name as editor of a humorous periodical. He declined another $10,000 for 10 lectures, and another offer for 50 lectures at the same rates, that is, $1,000 per night. He could get along without these sums, he said, and still preserve some remnants of his self-respect. It was May, 1899, when Clemens and his family left Vienna. They spent a summer in Sweden, on account of the health of Jean Clemens, and located in London apartments, 30 Wellington Court, for the winter. Then followed a summer at beautiful Dollis Hill, an old house where Gladstone had often visited, on a shady hilltop just outside of London. The city had not quite enclosed the place then, and there were spreading oaks, a pond with lily pads, and wide spaces of grassy lawn. The place today is converted into a public garden called Gladstone Park. Writing to Twichell in midsummer, Clemens said, "I am the only person who is ever in the house in the daytime, but I am working, and deep in the luxury of it. But there is one tremendous defect. Levy is all so enchanted with the place, and so in love with it, that she doesn't know how she is going to tear herself away from it." However, there was one still greater attraction than Dollis Hill, and that was America, home. Mark Twain, at 65, and a free man once more, had decided to return to his native land. They closed Dollis Hill at the end of September, and October 6, 1900, sailed on the Minnehaha for New York, bidding good-bye, as Mark Twain believed and hoped, to foreign travel. 9 days later, to a reporter who greeted him on the ship, he said, "If I ever get ashore, I am going to break both of my legs so I can't get away again." Chapter 54. This is Chapter 55 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 55, A Prophet at Home. New York tried to outdo Vienna and London in honoring Mark Twain. Every newspaper was filled with a story of his great fight against debt and his triumph. "He had behaved like Walter Scott," writes Howells, "as millions rejoiced to know who had not known how Walter Scott behaved, till they knew it was like Clemens." Clubs and societies vied with one another in offering him grand entertainments. Literary and lecture proposals poured in. He was offered at the rate of $1 a word for his writing. He could name his own terms for lectures. These sensational offers did not tempt him. He was sick of the platform. He made a dinner speech here and there, always an event, but he gave no lectures or readings for profit. His literary work he confined to a few magazines, and presently concluded an arrangement with Harper and Brothers for whatever he might write, the payment to be 20, later 30 cents per word. He arranged with the same firm for publication of all his books, by this time collected in uniform edition. He wished his affairs to be settled as nearly as might be. His desire was freedom from care. Also he would have liked a period of quiet and rest, but that was impossible. He realized that the multitude of honors tendered him was in a sense a vast compliment which he could not entirely refuse. Howells writes that Mark Twain's countrymen kept it up past all precedent, and in return Mark Twain tried to do his part. "His friends saw that he was wearing himself out," adds Howells, and certain it is that he grew thin and pale and had a hacking cough. Once to Richard Watson Gilder he wrote, "In bed with a chest cold and other company. Dear Gilder, I can't. If I were a well man I could explain with this pencil, but in the circumstances I will leave it all to your imagination. Was it Grady that killed himself trying to do all the dining and speeching? No, old man, no, no. Ever yours, Mark." In the various dinner speeches and other utterances made by Mark Twain at this time, his hearers recognized a new and great seriousness of purpose. It was not really new, only perhaps more emphasized. He still made them laugh, but he insisted on making them think, too. He preached a new gospel of patriotism, not the patriotism that means a boisterous cheering of the stars and stripes wherever unfurled, but the patriotism that proposes to keep the stars and stripes clean and worth shouting for. In one place he said, "We teach the boys to atrophy their independence. We teach them to take their patriotism at second hand, to shout with the largest crowd without examining into the right or wrong of the matter, exactly as boys under monarchies are taught, and have always been taught." He protested against the blind allegiance of monarchies. He was seldom with the largest crowd himself. Writing much of our foreign affairs, then in a good deal of a muddle, he sailed so fearlessly and fiercely measures which he held to be unjust that he was caricatured as an armed knight on a charger and as Huck Finn with a gun. But he was not always warlike. One of the speeches he made that winter was with Colonel Henry Watterson, a former Confederate soldier, at a Lincoln birthday memorial at Carnegie Hall. "Think of it," he wrote Twichell, "2 old rebels functioning there, I as president and Watterson as orator of the day. Things have changed somewhat in these 40 years, thank God." The Clemens household did not go back to Hartford. During their early years abroad it had been Mrs. Clemens's dream to return and open the beautiful home with everything the same as before. The death of Susy had changed all this. The mother had grown more and more to feel that she could not bear the sorrow of Susy's absence in the familiar rooms. After a trip which Clemens himself made to Hartford he wrote, "I realize that if we ever enter the house again to live, our hearts will break." So they did not go back. Mrs. Clemens had seen it for the last time on that day when the carriage waited while she went back to take a last look into the vacant rooms. They had taken a house at 14 West 10th Street for the winter, and when summer came they went to a log cabin on Saranac Lake, which they called the Lair. Here Mark Twain wrote a double-barreled detective story, a not very successful burlesque of Sherlock Holmes. But most of the time that summer he loafed and rested, as was his right. Once during the summer he went on a cruise with H. Rogers, Speaker Tom Reed, and others on Mr. Rogers' yacht. End of Chapter 55. This is Chapter 56 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 56, Honored by Missouri. The family did not return to New York. They took a beautiful house at Riverdale on the Hudson, the old Appleton homestead. Here they established themselves and settled down for American residence. They would have bought the Appleton place, but the price was beyond their reach. It was in the autumn of 1901 that Mark Twain settled in Riverdale. In June of the following year he was summoned West to receive the degree of Doctor of Laws from the university of his native state. He made the journey a sort of last general visit to old associations and friends. In St. Louis he saw Horace Bixby, fresh, wiry, and capable as he had been 45 years before. Clemens said, "I have become an old man. You are still 35." They went over to the rooms of the Pilots' Association, where the rivermen gathered in force to celebrate his return. Then he took train for Hannibal. He spent several days in Hannibal and saw Laura Hawkins, Mrs. Fraser, and a widow now, and John Briggs, an old man, and John Robards, who had worn the golden curls and the medal for good conduct. They drove him to the old house on Hill Street, where once he had lived and set type. Photographers were there and photographed him standing at the front door. "It all seems so small to me," he said as he looked through the house. "A boy's home is a big place to him. I suppose if I should come back again 10 years from now it would be the size of a bird-house." He did not see Huck. Torn Blankenship had not lived in Hannibal for many years. But he was driven to all the familiar haunts, to Lover's Leap, the Cave, and the rest. And Sunday afternoon, with John Briggs, he walked over Holliday's Hill, the Cardiff Hill of Tom Sawyer. It was just such a day as the one when they had damaged a cooper shop and so nearly finished the old negro driver. A good deal more than 50 years had passed since then, and now here they were once more, Tom Sawyer and Joe Harper, two old men, the hills still fresh and green, the river rippling in the sun, looking across to the Illinois shore and the green islands where they had played, and to Lover's Leap on the south. The man who had been Sam Clemens said, "John, that is one of the loveliest sights I ever saw. Down there is the place we used to swim, and yonder is where a man was drowned, and there's where the steamboat sank. Down there on Lover's Leap is where the Millerites put on their robes one night to go to heaven. None of them went that night, but I suppose most of them have gone now." John Briggs said, "Sam, do you remember the day we stole peaches from old man Price, and one of his bow-legged niggers came after us with dogs, and how we made up our minds we'd catch that nigger and drown him?" And so they talked on of this thing and that, and by and by drove along the river, and Sam Clemens pointed out the place where he swam it, and was taken with a cramp on the return. "Once near the shore I thought I would let down," he said, "but was afraid to, knowing that if the water was deep I was a goner. But finally my knee struck the sand and I crawled out. That was the closest call I ever had." They drove by a place where a haunted house had stood. They drank from a well they had always known, from the bucket, as they had always drunk, talking, always talking, touching with lingering fondness that most beautiful and safest of all our possessions, the past. "Sam," said John, when they parted, "this is probably the last time we shall meet on earth. God bless you. Perhaps somewhere we shall renew our friendship." "John," was the answer, "this day has been worth $1,000 to me. We were like brothers once, and I feel that we are the same now. Good-bye, John. I'll try to meet you somewhere." Clemens left next day for Columbia, where the university is located. At each station a crowd had gathered to cheer and wave as the train pulled in, and to offer him flowers. Sometimes he tried to say a few words, but his voice would not come. This was more than even Tom Sawyer had dreamed. Certainly there is something deeply touching in the recognition of one's native state. The return of the boy who has set out unknown to battle with life and who is called back to be crowned is unlike any other homecoming, more dramatic, more moving. Next day at the university, Mark Twain, summoned before the crowded assembly hall to receive his degree, stepped out to the center of the stage and paused. He seemed in doubt as to whether he should make a speech or only express his thanks for the honor received. Suddenly, and without signal, the great audience rose and stood in silence at his feet. He bowed, but he could not speak. Then the vast assembly began a peculiar chant, spelling out slowly the word MISSOURI, with a pause between each letter. It was tremendously impressive. Mark Twain was not left in doubt as to what was required of him when the chant ended. The audience demanded a speech, and he made them one, such a speech as no one there would forget to his dying day. Back in St. Louis he attended the rechristening of the St. Louis harbor boat. It had been previously called the St. Louis, but it was now to be called the Mark Twain. End of chapter 56. This is chapter 57 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 57, The Close of a Beautiful Life. Life, which had begun very cheerfully at Riverdale, ended sadly enough. In August, at York Harbor, Maine, Mrs. Clemens' health failed, and she was brought home an invalid, confined almost entirely to her room. She had been always the life, the center, the mainspring of the household. Now she must not even be consulted, hardly visited. On her bad days, and they were many, Clemens, sad and anxious, spent most of his time lingering about her door, waiting for news, or until he was permitted to see her for a brief moment. In his memorandum book of that period he wrote, "Our dear prisoner is where she is through overwork, day and night devotion to the children and me. We did not know how to value it. We know now." And on the margin of a letter, praising him for what he had done for the world's enjoyment and for his triumph over debt, he wrote, "Livy never gets her share of those applauses, but it is because the people do not know. Yet she is entitled to the lion's share." She improved during the winter, but very slowly. Her husband wrote in his diary, "February 2, 1903, 33rd wedding anniversary. I was allowed to see Livy 5 minutes this morning, in honor of the day." Mrs. Clemens had always remembered affectionately their winter in Florence of 10 years before, and she now expressed the feeling that if she were in Florence again she would be better. The doctors approved, and it was decided that she should be taken there as soon as she was strong enough to travel. She had so far improved by June that they journeyed to Elmira, where in the quiet rest of Quarry Farm her strength returned somewhat, and the hope of her recovery was strong. Mark Twain wrote a story that summer in Elmira, in the little octagonal study, shut in now by trees and overgrown with vines. A Dog's Tale, a pathetic plea against vivisection, was the last story written in the little retreat that had seen the beginning of Tom Sawyer 29 years before. There was a feeling that the stay in Europe was this time to be permanent. On one of the first days of October Clemens wrote in his notebook, "Today I place flowers on Susy's grave, for the last time probably, and read the words, 'Good night, dear heart, good night, good night.'" They sailed on the 24th by way of Naples and Genoa, and were presently installed in the Via Reale di Quarto, a fine old Italian palace, in an ancient garden looking out over Florence, toward Vallombrosa and the Chianti Hills. It was a beautiful spot, though its aging walls and cypresses and matted vines gave it a rather mournful look. Mrs. Clemens's health improved there for a time, in spite of dull, rainy, depressing weather, so much so that in May, when the warmth and sun came back, Clemens was driving about the country seeking a villa that he might buy for a home. On one of these days, it was a Sunday in early June, the 5th, when he had been out with Jean and found a villa which he believed would fill all their requirements, he came home full of enthusiasm and hope, eager to tell the patient about the discovery. Certainly she seemed better. A day or two before she had been wheeled out on the terrace to enjoy the wonder of early Italian summer. He found her bright and cheerful, anxious to hear all their plans for the new home. He stayed with her alone through the dinner hour, and their talk was as in the old days. Summoned to go at last, he chided himself for staying so long, but she said there was no harm, and kissed him, saying, "You will come back?" And he answered, "Yes, to say good night," meaning at 9:30, as was the permitted custom. He stood a moment at the door, throwing kisses to her, and she returned them, her face bright with smiles. He was so full of hope. They were going to be happy again. Long ago he had been in the habit of singing jubilee songs to the children. He went upstairs now to the piano, and played the chorus, and sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and "My Lord, He Calls Me." He stopped then, but Jean, who had come in, asked him to go on. Mrs. Clemens, from her room, heard the music, and said to Katy Leary, "He is singing a good-night carol to me." The music ceased presently. A moment later she asked to be lifted up. Almost in that instant life slipped away without a sound. Clemens, just then coming to say good night, saw a little group gathered about her bed, and heard Clara ask, "Katy, is it true? Oh, Katy, is it true?" In his notebook that night he wrote, "At 9:15 this evening, she that was the life of my life passed to the relief and the peace of death, after 22 months of unjust and unearned suffering. I first saw her 37 years ago, and now I have looked upon her face for the last time. I was full of remorse for things done and said in these 34 years of married life that have hurt Livy's heart." And to Howells a few days later, "Today, treasured in her worn Old Testament, I found a dear and gentle letter from you, dated Far Rockaway, September 12, 1896, about our poor Susy's death. I am tired and old. I wish I were with Livy." They brought her to America, and from the house and the rooms where she had been made a bride bore her to a grave beside Susy and little Langdon. End of chapter 57. This is Chapter 58 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 58, Mark Twain at 70. In a small cottage belonging to Richard Watson Gilder at Tyringham, Massachusetts, Samuel Clemens and his daughters tried to plan for the future. Mrs. Clemens had always been the directing force. They were lost without her. They finally took a house in New York City, No. 21 Fifth Avenue, at the corner of 9th Street, installed the familiar furnishings, and tried once more to establish a home. The house was handsome within and without, a proper residence for a venerable author and sage, a suitable setting for Mark Twain. But it was lonely for him. It lacked soul, comfort that would reach the heart. He added presently a great Aeolian orchestral, with a variety of music for his different moods. Sometimes he played it himself, though oftener his secretary played to him. He went out little that winter, seeing only a few old and intimate friends. His writing, such as it was of a serious nature, protests against oppression and injustice in a variety of forms. Once he wrote a war prayer, supposed to have been made by a mysterious white-robed stranger who enters a church during those ceremonies that precede the marching of the nation's armies to battle. The minister had prayed for victory, a victory which the stranger interprets as a petition that the enemy's country be laid waste, its soldiers be torn by shells, its people turned out roofless, to wander through their desolated land in rags and hunger. It was a scathing arraignment of war, a prophecy indeed, which today has been literally fulfilled. He did not print it, because then it would have been regarded as sacrilege. When summer came again, in a beautiful house at Dublin, New Hampshire, on the Monadnock slope, he seemed to get back into the old swing of work, and wrote that pathetic story, A Horse's Tale. Also Eve's Diary, which, under its humor, is filled with tenderness. And he began a wildly fantastic tale entitled 3,000 Years Among the Microbes, a satire in which Gulliver is outdone. He never finished it. He never could finish it, for it ran off into amazing bypaths that led nowhere, and the tale was lost. Yet he always meant to get at it again some day and make order out of chaos. Old friends were dying, and Mark Twain grew more and more lonely. "My section of the procession has but a little way to go," he wrote when the great English actor Henry Irving died. Charles Henry Webb, his first publisher, John Hay, Bret Harte, Thomas B. Reed, and, indeed, most of his earlier associates were gone. When an invitation came from San Francisco to attend a California reunion, he replied that his wandering days were over, and that it was his purpose to sit by the fire for the rest of his life. And in another letter, "I have done more for San Francisco than any other of its old residents. Since I left there it has increased in population fully 300,000. I could have done more. I could have gone earlier, it was suggested." A choice example, by the way, of Mark Twain's best humor, with its perfectly timed pause and the afterthought. Most humorists would have been content to end with the statement, "I could have gone earlier." Only Mark Twain could have added that final exquisite touch, "it was suggested." Mark Twain was nearing 70. With the 30th of November, 1905, he would complete the scriptural limitation, and the president of his publishing house, Colonel George Harvey of Harper's, proposed a great dinner for him in celebration of his grand maturity. Clemens would have preferred a small assembly in some snug place with only his oldest and closest friends. Colonel Harvey had a different view. He had given a small choice dinner to Mark Twain on his 67th birthday. Now it must be something really worth while, something to outrank any former literary gathering. In order not to conflict with Thanksgiving holidays, the 5th of December was selected as the date. On that evening 200 American and English men and women of letters assembled in Delmonico's great banquet hall to do honor to their chief. What an occasion it was! The tables of gay diners, and among them Mark Twain, his snow-white hair a gleaming beacon for every eye. Then, by and by, presented by William Dean Howells, he rose to speak. Instantly the brilliant throng was on its feet, a shouting billow of life, the white handkerchiefs flying foam-like on its crest. It was a supreme moment, the greatest one of them all, hailed by their applause as he scaled the mountain-top. Never did Mark Twain deliver a more perfect address than he gave that night. He began with the beginning, the meagerness of that little hamlet that had seen his birth, and sketched it all so quaintly and delightfully that his hearers laughed and shouted, though there was tenderness under it, and often the tears were just beneath the surface. He told of his habits of life, how he had reached 70 by following a plan of living that would probably kill anybody else, how in fact he believed he had no valuable habits at all. Then at last came that unforgettable close. 60 years and 10. It is the scriptural statute of limitations. After that you owe no active duties. For you the strenuous life is over. You are a time-expired man, to use Kipling's military phrase. You have served your term, well or less well, and you are mustered out. You are become an honorary member of the Republic. You are emancipated. Compulsions are not for you, nor any bugle call but lights out. You pay the time-worn duty bills if you choose, or decline if you prefer, and without prejudice, for they are not legally collectible. The previous engagement plea, which in 40 years has cost you so many twinges, you can lay aside forever. On this side of the grave you will never need it again. If you shrink at thought of night and winter and the late homecomings from the banquet and the lights and laughter through the deserted streets, a desolation which would not remind you now, as for a generation it did, that your friends are sleeping and you must creep in a tiptoe and not disturb them, but would only remind you that you need not tiptoe, you can never disturb them more. If you shrink at the thought of these things you need only reply, "Your invitation honors me and pleases me because you still keep me in your remembrance, but I am 70, and would nestle in the chimney-corner and smoke my pipe and read my book and take my rest, wishing you well in all affection, and that when you, in your turn, shall arrive at Pier 70, you may step aboard your waiting ship with a reconciled spirit, and lay your course toward the sinking sun with a contented heart." The tears that had been lying in wait were no longer kept back. If there were any present who did not let them flow without shame, who did not shout their applause from throats choked with sobs, they failed to mention the fact later. Many of his old friends, one after another, rose to tell their love for him. Cable, Carnegie, Gilder, and the rest. Mr. Rogers did not speak, nor the Reverend Twichell, but they sat at his special table. Aldrich could not be there, but wrote a letter. A group of English authors, including Alfred Austin, Barrie, Chesterton, Dobson, Doyle, Hardy, Kipling, Lang, and others, joined in a cable. Helen Keller wrote, "And you are 70 years old, or is the report exaggerated, like that of your death? I remember, when I saw you last, at the house of dear Mr. Hutton in Princeton, you said, 'If a man is a pessimist before he is 48, he knows too much. If he is an optimist after he is 48, he knows too little.' Now we know you are an optimist, and nobody would dare to accuse one on the seven-terraced summit of knowing little. So probably you are not 70 after all, but only 47." Helen Keller was right. Mark Twain was never a pessimist in his heart. End of chapter 58. This is Chapter 59 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 59. Mark Twain arranges for his biography. It was at the beginning of 1906, a little more than a month after the 70th birthday dinner, that the writer of these chapters became personally associated with Mark Twain. I had met him before, and from time to time he had returned a kindly word about some book I had written, and inconsiderately sent him, for he had been my literary hero from childhood. Once, indeed, he had allowed me to use some of his letters in a biography I was writing of Thomas Nast. He had been always an admirer of the great cartoonist, and the permission was kindness itself. Before the seating at the birthday dinner I happened to find myself for a moment alone with Mark Twain, and remembered to thank him in person for the use of the letters. A day or two later I sent him a copy of the book. I did not expect to hear from it again. It was a little while after this that I was asked to join in a small private dinner to be given to Mark Twain at the Players, in celebration of his being made an honorary member of that club, there being at the time only one other member of this class, Sir Henry Irving. I was in the Players a day or two before the event, and David Monroe, of the North American Review, a man whose gentle and kindly nature made him David to all who knew him, greeted me joyfully, his face full of something he knew I would wish to hear. He had been chosen, he said, to propose the Players' dinner to Mark Twain, and had found him propped up in bed, and beside him a copy of the Nast book. I suspect now that David's generous heart prompted Mark Twain to speak of the book, and that his comment had lost nothing in David's eager retelling. But I was too proud and happy to question any feature of the precious compliment, and Monroe, always most happy in making others happy, found opportunity to repeat it, and even to improve upon it, usually in the presence of others, several times during the evening. The Players' dinner to Mark Twain was given on the evening of January 3, 1906, and the picture of it still remains clear to me. The guests, assembled around a single table in the private dining-room, did not exceed 25 in number. Brander Matthews presided, and the knightly Frank Millet, who would one day go down on the Titanic, was there, and Gilder, and Monroe, and David Bispham, and Robert Reed, and others of their kind. It so happened that my seat was nearly facing the guest of the evening, who by a custom of the Players is placed at the side and not at the distant end of the long table. Regarding him at leisure, I saw that he seemed to be in full health. He had an alert, rested look. His complexion had the tints of a miniature painting. Lit by the soft glow of the shaded candles, outlined against the richness of the shadowed walls, he made a figure of striking beauty. I could not take my eyes from it, for it stirred in me the farthest memories. I saw the interior of a farmhouse sitting-room in the Middle West, where I had first heard the name of Mark Twain, and where night after night a group had gathered around the evening lamp to hear read aloud the story of the Innocents on their Holy Land pilgrimage, which to a boy of 8 had seemed only a wonderful poem and fairy-tale. To Charles Harvey Genung, who sat next to me, I whispered something of this, and how during the 36 years since then no one had meant to me quite what Mark Twain had meant, in literature and, indeed, in life. Now here he was just across the table. It was a fairy tale come true. Genung said, "You should write his life." It seemed to me no more than a pleasant remark, but he came back to it again and again, trying to encourage me with the word that Monroe had brought back concerning the biography of Nast. However, nothing of what he said had kindled any spark of hope. I put him off by saying that certainly someone of longer and closer friendship and larger experience had been selected for the work. Then the speaking began, and the matter went out of my mind. Later in the evening, when we had left our seats and were drifting about the table, I found a chance to say a word to our guest concerning his Joan of Arc, which I had recently reread. To my happiness he told me that long-ago incident, the stray leaf from Joan's life, blown to him by the wind, which had led to his interest in all literature. Then presently I was with Genung again, and he was still insisting that I write the life of Mark Twain. It may have been his faithful urging, it may have been the quick sympathy kindled by the name of Joan of Arc. Whatever it was, in the instant of bidding good-bye to our guest I was prompted to add, "May I call to see you, Mr. Clemens, some day?" And something to this day, I do not know what, prompted him to answer, "Yes, come soon." 2 days later, by appointment with his secretary, I arrived at 21 Fifth Avenue, and waited in the library to be summoned to his room. A few moments later I was ascending the long stairs, wondering why I had come on so useless an errand, trying to think up an excuse for having come at all. He was propped up in bed, a regal bed from a dismantled Italian palace, delving through a copy of Huckleberry Finn, in search of a paragraph concerning which some unknown correspondent had inquired. He pushed the cigars toward me, commenting amusingly on this correspondent and on letter-writing in general. By and by, when there came a lull, I told him what so many thousands had told him before, what his work had meant to me, so long ago, and recalled my childish impressions of that large black and gilt book with its wonderful pictures and adventures, The Innocents Abroad. Very likely he was willing enough to let me change the subject presently and thank him for the kindly word which David Monroe had brought. I do not remember what was his comment, but I suddenly found myself saying that out of his encouragement had grown a hope, though certainly it was less, that I might some day undertake a book about himself. I expected my errand to end at this point, and his silence seemed long and ominous. He said at last that from time to time he had himself written chapters of his life, but that he had always tired of the work and put it aside. He added that he hoped his daughters would one day collect his letters, but that a biography, a detailed story of a man's life and effort, was another matter. I think he added one or two other remarks, then all at once, turning upon me those piercing agate blue eyes, he said, "When would you like to begin?" There was a dresser, with a large mirror, at the end of the room. I happened to catch my reflection in it, and I vividly recollect saying to it, mentally, "This is not true. It is only one of many similar dreams." But even in a dream one must answer, and I said, "Whenever you like. I can begin now." He was always eager in any new undertaking. "Very good," he said. "The sooner, then, the better. Let's begin while we are in the humor. The longer you postpone a thing of this kind, the less likely you are ever to get at it." This was on Saturday. I asked if Tuesday, January 9th, would be too soon to start. He agreed that Tuesday would do, and inquired as to my plan of work. I suggested bringing a stenographer to make notes of his life story as he could recall it, this record to be supplemented by other material, letters, journals, and what not. He said, "I think I should enjoy dictating to a stenographer with someone to prompt me and act as audience. The room adjoining this was fitted up for my study. My manuscript and notes and private books and many of my letters are there, and there are a trunkful or two of such things in the attic. I seldom use the room myself. I do my writing and reading in bed. I will turn that room over to you for this work. Whatever you need will be brought to you. We can have the dictations here in the morning, and you can put in the rest of the day to suit yourself. You can have a key and come and go as you please." That was always his way. He did nothing by halves. He got up and showed me the warm luxury of the study, with its mass of material, disordered, but priceless. I have no distinct recollections of how I came away, but presently, back at the Players, I was confiding the matter to Charles Harvey Genung, who said he was not surprised, but I think he was. End of chapter 59. This is chapter 60 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 60, Working with Mark Twain. It was true, after all, and on Tuesday morning, January 9, 1906, I was on hand with a capable stenographer ready to begin. Clemens, meantime, had developed a new idea. He would like to add, he said, the new dictations to his former beginnings, completing an autobiography which was to be laid away and remain unpublished for 100 years. He would pay the stenographer himself and own the notes, allowing me, of course, free use of them as material for my book. He did not believe that he could follow the story of his life in its order of dates, but would find it necessary to wander around, picking up the thread as memory or fancy prompted. I could suggest subjects and ask questions. I assented to everything, and we set to work immediately. As on my former visit, he was in bed when we arrived, though clad now in a rich Persian dressing-gown and propped against great snowy pillows. A small table beside him held his pipes, cigars, papers, also a reading lamp, the soft light of which brought out his brilliant coloring and the gleam of his snowy hair. There was daylight, too, but it was dull winter daylight from the north, while the walls of the room were a deep, unreflecting red. He began that morning with some memories of the Comstock mine. Then he dropped back to his childhood, closing at last with some comment on matters quite recent. How delightful it was, his quaint, unhurried fashion of speech, the unconscious habits of his delicate hands, the play of his features as his fancies and phrases passed through his mind and were accepted or put aside. We were watching one of the great literary creatures of his time in the very process of his architecture. Time did not count. When he finished, at last, we were all amazed to find that more than 2 hours had slipped away. "And how much I have enjoyed it," he said. "It is the ideal plan for this kind of work. Narrative writing is always disappointing. The moment you pick up a pen, you begin to lose the spontaneity of the personal relation, which contains the very essence of interest. With shorthand dictation one can talk as if he were at his own dinner-table, always an inspiring place. I expect to dictate all the rest of my life, if you good people are willing to come and listen to it." The dictations thus begun continued steadily from week to week, with increasing charm. We never knew what he was going to talk about, and it was seldom that he knew until the moment of beginning. But it was always fascinating, and I felt myself the most fortunate biographer in the world, as indeed I was. It was not all smooth sailing, however. In the course of time I began to realize that these marvelous dictated chapters were not altogether history, but were often partly or even entirely imaginary. The creator of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn had been embroidering old incidents or inventing new ones too long to stick to history now, to be able to separate the romance in his mind from the reality of the past. Also, his memory of personal events had become inaccurate. He realized this, and once said, in his whimsical, gentle way, "When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it happened or not. But I'm getting old, and soon I shall remember only the latter." Yet it was his constant purpose to stick to fact, and especially did he make no effort to put himself in a good light. Indeed, if you wanted to know the worst of Mark Twain, you had only to ask him for it. He would give it to the last syllable, and he would improve upon it and pile up his sins, and sometimes the sins of others, without stint. Certainly the dictations were precious, for they revealed character as nothing else could. But as material for history they often failed to stand the test of the documents in the next room, the letters, notebooks, agreements, and the like, from which I was gradually rebuilding the structure of the years. In the talks that we usually had when the dictations were ended and the stenographer had gone, I got much that was of great value. It was then that I usually made those inquiries which we had planned in the beginning, and his answers, coming quickly and without reflection, gave imagination less play. Sometimes he would touch some point of special interest and walk up and down philosophizing or commenting upon things in general, in a manner not always complimentary to humanity and its progress. I seldom asked him a question during the dictation, or interrupted in any way, though he had asked me to stop him when I found him repeating or contradicting himself, or misstating some fact known to me. At first I lacked the courage to point out a mistake at the moment, and cautiously mentioned the matter when he had finished. Then he would be likely to say, "Why didn't you stop me? Why did you let me go on making a donkey of myself when you could have saved me?" So then I used to take the risk of getting struck by lightning, and nearly always stopped him in time. But if it happened that I upset his thought, the thunderbolt was apt to fly. He would say, "Now you've knocked everything out of my head." Then of course I was sorry and apologized, and in a moment the sky was clear again. There was generally a humorous complexion to the dictations, whatever the subject. Humor was his natural breath of life, and rarely absent. Perhaps I should have said sooner that he smoked continuously during the dictations. His cigars were of that delicious fragrance which belongs to domestic tobacco. They were strong and inexpensive, and it was only his early training that made him prefer them. Admiring friends used to send him costly imported cigars, but he rarely touched them, and they were smoked by visitors. He often smoked a pipe, and preferred it to be old and violent. Once, when he had bought a new, expensive briar-root, he handed it to me, saying, "I'd like to have you smoke that a year or two, and when it gets so you can't stand it, maybe it will suit me." End of chapter 60.